contrast between what is happening around Europe versus what's happening in the United States is, at the very least, an interesting one. From Germany to Brussels to Poland to Portugal, these historic protests were based on an extraordinary unity, people rallying behind a common struggle. I want to delve deeper into this, and I'm joined now by Richard Wolff, economist, author, and economics professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and also a visiting professor at the New School University in New York, which is where he joins us from now. Hey there, Richard. We compare Europe to the United States. Europe is made up of so many countries, differing cultures and languages. I know you were there recently. You spent the summer lecturing in Greece and France. Talk about what sort of lit this fire.
Well, I think it's the decision of the Europeans to overcome all of their differences, their different cultures and languages, in a common struggle against these austerity programs. You basically see here a population that says, we have suffered 3 years of this crisis, we have suffered unemployment and all of its tragedies. We will not permit the government to impose even more burdens on them as they go about trying to fix this crisis. We didn't cause it. It should not be taken out of our hides. And they are demonstrating a level of commitment and unity that is astonishing. It is not just now about austerity. It's about changing the whole way government and the history of Europe is about to evolve.
And back to the United States, there are plenty of protests, of course. We're here in Washington, D.C. We see them just about every weekend. But it seems that these protests are more about ideological issues as opposed to some of these more bread and butter issues like workers' rights. Any insight to why that might be?
I think it's clear. I think in Europe for the last 30 years, you've had a pretty vibrant trade union movement compared to what we have in this country. You have active socialist, communist, and other radical organizations excuse me, that analyze what's going on in an ongoing way with daily newspapers and daily media outlets. You have an educated population that can see these issues. I think Americans see the issues, but have no organized basis after the long-term decline of our labor movement and our left organizations. So it's taking longer in the United States to mobilize because we have to organize from scratch these kinds of groupings and unities. The Europeans could rely on their tradition and put them into play much more quickly. They are the future that the United States is in fact moving to, and that the October 2nd actions in Washington were the first step on the road to that outcome.
Let's break this down a little bit here. Talk to me about the winners and the losers in these fights. I mean, who stands to gain from these protests around Europe, and what do you think Americans are so afraid of by not standing up to some of these big issues?
Well, I think in Europe the winners and the losers are pretty clear. The hope of the business community, led by the financial industries, was that they could come out of this crisis even stronger than they were before, that the immense costs, calculated in the trillions, to fix this economic crisis would not come by taxes and burdens on them, but instead by an austerity, laying off workers, cutting social programs. What the European masses have now done is to declare that plan isn't going to work. The people who benefited from this crisis, who brought it about, and who have escaped unscathed to this point, are now going to have to pay a big share of the cost. I believe Americans want the same thing, but they don't have the institutions and the organizations to vent their upset. So in their anger, they get distracted by the symbol of a mosque in New York City, by the teabag rhetoric about a socialism that's nowhere to be found. They're casting about for a way. The Europeans are ahead of us. They have a clear vision, and they have the organizations that clearly can mobilize millions of people in strikes, general strikes, and manifestations that force the change to put the cost of this crisis on the capitalist enterprises who were most responsible for producing it.
Certainly would be interesting to talk to some of those people in Europe, get their take on exactly how Americans are acting. I always like to hear that side of the story. Richard Wolff, professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts, also an author and visiting professor at the New School in New York.